So I've just been to the Sustainable Brands conference in Detroit. This is the flagship conference for the Sustainable Brands Network, and once a year they get together with the biggest heavy hitters in the world in what does sustainable brands mean, what are they doing. This year's theme was Delivering the Good Life, which followed up the previous years of redefining the good life and designing it. So this was all about the doing of it, not just talking about it. It was a phenomenal trip. If there was anywhere to be in the world that you're meeting the leaders and who's doing things as well as who's starting, it was very accessible for anyone who wants to find out what the latest issues and trends are, and just to meet people who are really doing something, not just talking about it, with some of the real heavy hitters in the world doing stuff, and not just companies but other kinds of organisations who are part of it as well. Phenomenal. I think the only downside was there was so much going on that I couldn't get to everything. The key things that came out of it, one was a really big push to significantly transform the idea of marketing itself, what that role does and who can do it and where it fits with an organisation. So to really get past the traditional thinking of, product price, purchasing and move beyond that. One, to add a new P, which is the P of purpose. So there's lots of talk about purpose-led brands, what that means, how you can do it in a real way and design your company around that. But there was also a big pushback against thinking of people in society as just consumers and market segments. So really a big pushback is in this is about people. If we want to have brands for the social and environmental good, we've got to keep people in the mix we've got to work with them in within our organisations, co-design with people and not market them to them as if they're this faceless segment. My favourite was the Chief Marketing Officer from Danone, Valerie Hernando-Press, who talked about how they're designing all of their work around this and about how they work with people and co-design with people, and welcomed us all to the human-to-human era. So getting past B2B, B2C thinking, it's just it's H2H, human to human, and that's how we're going to be able to stay relevant as a brand, and that's how we'll be able to grow because we're doing it with people. There was the debate about purpose-led brands, what that means, a few people getting a bit of purpose fatigue. And so the question was, does every brand need to have this burning purpose that it follows? And the general answer was no, but if you are wanting to have purpose sort of as a key thing that you talk about and design around, here are some ways to do it. But you can go ahead and be a brand that's got social environmental good in mind, without having to have purpose-led sort of everywhere in your comms and everything. Another really interesting thing that came through was the different ways that people are positioning sustainability and their messaging around sustainability. So instead of it being this big push to make sustainability desirable, attractive, and part of everyday life, particularly as you can't just buy a sustainable life, you need to live it with what we eat, how we move around, where we live and work. So all fantastic ideas and examples of how people are doing this. We had Allbirds showing how their shop fronts, how they call it 3D, three-dimensional design in their messaging for how they engage people in sustainable materials and ways of living. We had Target, who's about huge mass market, doing amazing things in everyday society. They talked about their position things as style. So style comes first and sustainability is within that, but it's not sort of thrown as the primary thing in their messaging. We had some interesting stats. For instance, Westrock, who's a packaging company, talked about how when people are looking at what the messages they'll get about a brand sustainability is first through its packaging, what they see that's surrounding that product, and that's far more important than what's on the website and in their report. And with that, there was a lot of talk about product as a service. So this is something that us in New Zealand have heard a lot. We see it coming through all the time, but some really good examples of how businesses are thinking of themselves as our product is a service, and we need to design around that. There was quite a key theme around circular economy at Sustainable Brands. We were fortunate to have Bill McDonough, who is the one of the originators of cradle to cradle thinking. And while I personally was wondering if how that fits in 2019, how he was showing that the design thinking that goes around that and how it can be applied to systems thinking and how it's sort of playing out in the field, whether it's got that official title of cradle to cradle or not, how that kind of thinking has expanded around the world was fascinating. And there were quite a lot of companies talking about how they are looking at circular economy in their value chain. So CHEP, North America, who I was lucky enough to video, they launched their Zero Waste World initiative. There were lots of other brands just talking about how they wanted to add a new element to all their materials, and if the product of a service are our items recoverable as well as recyclable, and how are we working with people in the supply chain, and a different view on how the metrics they use and how they measure the resources they're using and how that's coming back as feedstock in other places. There was quite a stern warning throughout it, which was valid, which was there's a lot of talk about plastics and about recycling, but it's very dangerous to think that it's mission accomplished if we start recycling things and have a better recycling system. That's a very small part of what's happening. So don't get caught in that trap of one particular kind of material and one kind of process as being you've transformed the system. You haven't. You've just addressed one part of it. Useful for marketers about how to get past the value action gap or the intent action gap, which is just what people, when they say they're going to do something or would like to do something, how that often translates into them. It's unlikely that they'll go through it. So you might have 65% of people say they want to do something, 30% actually do it. And that's a huge problem for marketers and for brands generally, for all this great messaging and all this great work, how to actually translate into action. How do you get past that with the different kinds of messages you have, where they turn up? Again, if you're this problem of if you don't focus on people, if you just think about market segments, that's a huge part of the problem. So some really good tips for people about how to close that gap and get action to happen. In the environmental side of things, so there was my personal favourite thing was the suggestion of a science-based targets for forests. How can we think about having a forest positive future? And what does a 1.5 degree equivalent look like in terms of quality and quantity for having the forest amount back in the world that can help biodiversity and ecosystems and be part of the regenerative economy that we talk about? And that's one way to sort of look at how we can create targets to get there and avoid that tipping point where we just literally don't have enough trees to support the world's systems. There was also the idea of tree equity, just in terms of the kinds of health benefits from, especially in the urban space, having biodiverse trees and plants, what that actually does for the health of communities and people. There was actually a lot of the framing around sustainability was around health, planetary health and people's health as well. So there was definitely a trend towards things like nutrition and well-being in that health way, which is a little bit we've seen in New Zealand, but I expect we'll start to see that more. That there was a fair bit of talk about the sort of social sustainability as well. We had an 11-year-old from Flint, Michigan talk to us. She was 8 when the water poisoning scandal hit Flint. Pretty much everyone was in tears. It makes me upset even to think about it. And talking about what she and other kids who weren't even, in double digits age by that stage, their activism to get their voices heard and to help people in the community who are suffering and what's happening now, because it's not over. We also heard from True Colours Brewery, a North Carolina Brewery that's bringing together men and boys who are from rival gangs together to work on a social impact enterprise that brews beer. And they do a lot of work with these people to help them grow as people, and then they grow as a team, and it's linked to a campaign to end gun violence. And we had an incredible talk by Ovi Mogeli, who is an ex-fullback from the Ravens. Don't ask me more about football, that's as much as I know. But he was talking about how sports can be a catalyst. And I think that's a call out. I'd love to talk to New Zealand Rugby and other sports codes about that. Getting kids engaged in environmental activism through sports. And he has published a comic called Gridiron Green that it's a little bit like Captain Planet for young Gridiron fans. That was one of the few places that the Sustainable Development Goals was mentioned that I saw, because it's linked in this comic book. But oddly enough, the SDGs didn't come up a lot in the rest of the conference, not the sessions I went to anyway. They may have been in other ones. And even when questions were asked about it, there weren't really solid answers to companies who are aligning with the SDGs and designing strategy around it, how that fits with this. So yes, it feels like there's a bit of a gap in how to connect that to brand thinking and market transformation. But they launched the Brands for Good campaign, and that's a set of 3 commitments that brands such as Pepsi, National Geographic, Target, Procter & Gamble and others, the founders have joined this sort of coalition or campaign, and they are committing to these 3 things in terms of how they align their brand and how they want to use it for social and environmental good. I am going to look into that more to see if there's scope for New Zealand brands to join that, and how that's going to roll out globally. And as part of that, there was an action roadmap toolkit that people could do, and we did a test one as well. So there's 5 different ways that you can look at your operations, products, value chain, messaging, governance, and a few other things, and it gives you a scale of 0 to 5 on all these different areas. And the aim is to get to 5 across all of them that would mark you as a sustainable brand. So that's just in its testing phase at the moment. There's a couple of our members that might trial that, and I'll keep in touch with them to see how that goes, as well as keep in touch with Sustainable Brands to see if there's something in it for our members that's not adding to the work we're doing. Is it complementing something we do? Is it a good sort of another internal reflective checkpoint on how we're doing before we get to the polishing the apple stage, which is what they said. You need to do all this internal work to be a real sustainable brand before you can even get to the stage of talking about it. Lots of ideas about other ways to have cultural shift, because again, being about people, all these ideas need to actually be activated by people and owned by people. When we're empowered, and there's all these different groups of people being empowered around the world, that's where things can happen. It can't just be in the hands of the brands themselves. They've got the big job to do to make things easier, more accessible and desirable for people, but that includes listening to the voices and including everyone else who gets impacted by this and has a stake in it. If members do contact me about it, this will come up in some of the ongoing Good Life playbook conversations we have, as well as some of the webinars that we'll have, and I'll try and keep you all up to date with how things roll out and the trends as they progress. One, the sense of that this was happening in reality. There is enough pressure on brands being held to account by people that they can't just talk about it anymore. So that's a positive thing with people have to actually do this, or they'll lose relevance or get a bad reputation. And the fact that you had these very big brands that have billions of market share are the ones who are saying they force themselves to be transparent, and they're the ones who are really pushing hard on themselves. Of course, that's not everybody, these are the leaders, but to have these, that it's not niche, these are very big brands doing the work, I think that's makes it a really good aspiration for others. And I think the idea that these, from whichever roles people are coming from, the fact that this is about people and that message is really starting to be heard. That we are getting past the sort of the glossy view on this, that there's this understanding that it's about cultural shift and people are part of culture and people are the architects of culture, that it's on us to do it, and the brands need to just work with that and capture it in a way. Don't forget that you have personal power as well, that we all create our culture, and so we can take a part in re-engineering culture or recreating things and shifting it. There's this mixture of art and science. Sustainability is not just about numbers and stats, and it's not just about pretty, beautiful things to capture our attention. There's a real blend of all of that, and it's very inspiring to be around some very clever people that are blending art and science in a way to engage us and get these positive changes to happen. So for all you members watching, please do talk to me about it, ask me more questions, because there'll be plenty more to chat with you on.